Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ed Arnold, and I'm Vice President of Products here at LeveragePoint. I'd like to welcome all of you to another one of our monthly webinars of thought leadership in value-based strategy, sponsored by LeveragePoint. LeveragePoint provides the only software solution for value-based pricing. We offer a cloud-based collaboration platform that supports product innovation, as well as sales enablement, that changes the way companies create, communicate, and capture value. Find out more about us from our website at leveragepoint.com. Now, during the webinar, if you have any specific questions or comments, please feel free to enter them in the right-hand panel in the question section, and then we'll respond to as many as we have time. Now it's time to introduce today's speaker. We are very pleased to have with us once again Dr. John Hogan. John is co-author of that classic pricing book, The Strategy and Tactics of Pricing, as well as numerous articles on the topics of value-based marketing strategies and, of course, strategic pricing. He's currently a founder of his own consultancy, Value Management Advisors, where he works with clients in a range of industries, including technology, healthcare, and manufacturing. Previously, John was a partner at the Monitor Group, which is where we met him, and his valuable insights have helped shape the design of the LeveragePoint platform. So, John, welcome, and thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks, Fed. Glad to be here. Before we dive into the topic today, I want to do a quick shout-out to Dick Orlando, who is the COO here at LeveragePoint, who is vacationing down in Florida and told me that he was going to be dialing in today. Dick, if you actually did dial in, hang up the phone and go enjoy your vacation. But the topic today is about how we use value-based design to drive new product success. And it's really a follow-on. I think it was back in February that we did a webinar that was focused on how we can inject customer value into the new product development process to change the way we think about and operate within the different stages, and how we change the stage gates or enhance stage gates with what we would term value gates. So that was a higher level kind of process approach. Now, what we're going to do in this webinar today is to dig in a little bit and to show how we can make specific design decisions around using customer value as a key metric. Okay? Specifically, what we're going to look at is a product manager who is in the process of developing a new product for launch has to make a number of decisions about which features are going to be prioritized for development and then move through the design process. We're going to talk about how we can fundamentally change that decision or improve that decision about which features move forward using the value-based approach. So let's dig in. So let me just start with a little framing. This is actually from a slide from the previous webinar, but it's a great place to start. I've always been a new product development junkie, if you will, and I remember back it was 1998, that the Product Development Management Association, the PDMA, launched or released a benchmarking survey, and it was really interesting. What they said, what the survey showed, was that new product launches were successful only about 10 to 12% of the time, which seemed remarkably low. Now remember, back in 98, that was about the time that the stage gate process was really coming into play. And so product development was a real key focus for a lot of companies for a long time. Well, in 2005, they released another study, and the rate had climbed to about 12 to 15%. So when I saw it, very excited, in 2010 and 2012, they released another benchmarking study, and it showed that the rate had leapt up. The success rate had increased substantially to almost 25%. And then I actually read the survey. And what they did is actually change the question so that it made it more likely that companies would say products were more successful. The takeaway is that really new product success rates have not changed fundamentally over the last decade, which is a remarkable, remarkable finding. So the question is, what can we legitimately do to make these products more successful? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I've been working with, over the years, as a pricing and value-based strategy consultant, I've been working with companies for years around new product launches, and probably have done between 40 and 50 of those in various industries. And there's a number of common problems that we see, and I think most people will recognize these in their own firms. I mean, probably one of the foremost, particularly for technology or technology-driven firms, is we launch products that are gold-plated and actually lack value. Okay, now what that means is we're developing products that improve performance, but that performance doesn't always translate into more benefits, economic benefits to the customer. So we have higher performing products the customers aren't willing to pay more for. Key problem that we've got to figure out how to solve. Second problem, now being an old pricing guy, that I couldn't let this pass, is we just take a fundamentally wrong approach to pricing. It's interesting, I've probably trained over 1,000 product managers, through the course of my career around value-based pricing and product management decisions. And one of the things that always happens, I ask people early on in the training, is to say, well, how do you actually set the price for a new product as you're moving through the development process? Now, I'm not on video, so you're going to have to imagine this yourself. But inevitably, there's an uncomfortable silence, and then somebody raises their hand, sticks it up in the air, and pinches something out of, like they're snatching something out of thin air, meaning the price, and they said that's the price that we end up using. And people start to nod their heads, and after a while people say, well, yeah, we kind of just wing it because we don't really have a solid approach. So what most companies end up doing is they use a cost-plus approach, which I won't go into the details here, but if you're using a cost-plus approach to pricing, it means one of two things. You're either overpricing the product or you're underpricing the product. It's a random chance that you actually have the right market price for the product. So not a great idea. And then the third thing, probably we see, is high development costs. And that comes in two forms. One is because we don't have clear metrics that are tied to market performance and business performance, that we end up iterating and cycling through to the process too often. And then the other problem we have around the high development costs is we end up developing these features that we can't get paid for, and that just drives up both the development costs and it drives up the cost of the product and doesn't help us be more successful once we hit the market. So how can we use value to begin to improve and make a difference here? Well, first of all, let's just stop and say, if we're trying to improve the development process, and it doesn't really matter if it's a stage gate process or if we're using more of an agile development process, we're still making many of the same fundamental decisions, okay? But there's three leverage points. One is, what data are we using, okay? Now, one of the things, if you look back on the history of product development, about the time that the stage gate process was really becoming accepted as a normal approach to product development, you started to see the use of voice of the customer research to feed the development process. Voice of the customer research is great, but it's the right data for the wrong purpose. If we're using that data to decide which features we're going to develop, what we end up with are features that customers like, but not necessarily features that create value for customers and are willing to pay for. So we've got to use some different data, and obviously you know where I'm coming from here. It's got to be customer value data to change that equation. Once we've got different data, the analytics change naturally. We're going to use different analytics to analyze that data, and then we're going to manage the process with different metrics as well. So enough of a preamble. What does it start to look like? Well, I'm going to argue and suggest that there's really three metrics that we want to look at to drive the new product development process, or at least three critical ones, as well as others that you may be using. First is value. Goes without saying. Now, why is customer value so important? And particularly, why is it so important early in the development process? And the reason it's so important is customer value establishes the revenue potential of a feature. So if we think about a potential feature, and if we could do a little bit of work, and it's not that hard, and a tool like Leverage Point is a great tool to help you do this, is if we can do a little bit of work and say what that feature, how much economic value that feature might create for a customer, now we know the ceiling, the most we ever could hope to get paid for that feature. So it gives us an upper bound of what that feature's worth. Now, let's come back. Once we know that, we can be much smarter about how much of that value we're going to capture with the price. Now, you say, well, how do I figure out the price early on in the development process? Well, first of all, we're not going to figure out the precise price. We're not setting a launch price here. what we're trying to do is get a price that's approximately right, not precisely wrong. So what we're going to do is say, look back on history and say, on average, for new products, what percentage of the value do we typically capture? Even if we don't know that, and a lot of companies don't early on, let's be naive and let's start at 50% as a good target to shoot for. So we start at 50% capture, and then we can adjust that based on some things we might know about the product. For example, if the benefit is kind of intangible, it's like, yep, it helps, it's a thing that people like, but it's not something that we can create a very clear line of sight to creating economic benefits for customers. Guess what? We're not going to be able to get paid as much for that feature as we might for others. So the value capture rate might be lower, it might be 25% instead of 50%. If it's a new technology versus a known technology, where it might force customers to apply the technology in a different way, we might not capture as much there. If it's a lower risk or a higher risk kind of feature, similar thing, we might adjust that value capture rate up or down. And again, that's perfectly fine at the early stages of the development process. And then obviously we want to look at cost. Now, here's what happens. If we're using these three metrics, what we're starting to define is that zone of profit that we can legitimately expect a feature might deliver to us. Okay, so let's take a look. And just to drive home how much impact these metrics can have on our development process, let me show you an example, a conceptual example, then I'm going to show you a case study, which is a real example of a company that has applied this approach. But let's start by saying, what would happen if we only used customer value as the metric and didn't think about a value-based price or cost? Well, you probably would go out there, you'd do a little work, you'd use the leverage point tool, you'd figure out what the value is on each of those features, a rough estimate at this stage, that's fine, and then you'd probably choose the three features that created the most value. Perfectly reasonable approach. Now, by the way, this is very similar to what using typical voice of the customer search does. It prioritizes based on what customers want the most. This is a little bit better because now we're actually tying it to the business economics, but we need additional metrics to make the decision. So let's add in price. So notice here now the dark blue bars are the value capture percentage that we might expect to get for different features. Recognizing, as we just talked about, some features will capture more of the value and others will capture less. So if you take a look at feature number 2, the value was pretty high for that feature, but the value capture is also pretty high. So that looks like we'd likely keep number 2 as a development option. But take a look at number 1. Maybe that feature creates a lot of value, but it involved a new technology that customers perceived to be risky. They weren't sure if their people could learn how to use it effectively, weren't sure if it would fit into their systems or their workflows. So a lot of risk there. So the value, even though they would look at it and say that has the potential to create a lot of value, they perceive that value to be quite risky. Our likelihood of capturing is less. Now, where we were prioritizing number 1 for development, now we look at it and say, maybe that's not the place where we can get the most profit out of our product. But it gets more interesting when we start to roll in cost. So if you take a look at the cost side, now that's the yellow bars here. Now all of a sudden, take a look at number 2, feature number 2. It starts to look quite different because we have a realistic understanding of how much price we could get from that feature. But if we start to look at the cost, and you see, wait a minute, the cost is actually, in this case, an extreme case where cost is higher than the price we could receive, that's clearly not going to be great for us. Now, one of two things could happen. One is we'd say that's not a feature we're going to advance, or it could force us to go back and think really hard about, is there a different way to deliver this feature that would drive the cost down significantly, because we can't make money on this feature. It's going to be just some additional gold plating that's going to drive down or lower our success rates. So if you look at incorporating all three metrics now, we end up with a fundamentally different answer than we did when we started just looking at a value-based metric. Now we're looking at number 3, 4, and 5 as, hey, you know what, there's reasonable differences between the price we could achieve, the cost we could capture, and you'd say, those guys are interesting for development. And that's the fundamental principle that we want to start to think about as we're moving into what I would argue is a smarter approach to development that is treating customer value as your ultimate leverage, that we're going to have to make sure that we're leveraging that as we're going through the development process so that we can actually get paid on the back end. So let me give you an example. Let me show you. That's all good conceptual stuff. But let's talk about a real company. Now, this is a company that has applied this approach to fundamentally change their both approach to product development, but also it started to change the nature of their product portfolio in some pretty substantial ways. This is a technology company, dealt with signal processing, very sophisticated kinds of electronics up in the Pacific Northwest. Big company, like a lot of companies today, they were facing some significant disruptions in the market, some new competitors coming into the market from overseas. It was really changing the landscape and their ability to get paid. And what they realized was that they had to step back and think about how they're going to be taking new products to market because there was less room for error in their marketplace. So I came across these guys. I was actually doing a value-based pricing project with them for a different product, and it was really interesting. This happens almost every time I've ever done a new product pricing project. Is about 4 or 5 weeks into the project. At some point, the sponsor slaps their head, and he says, "Wait a minute! This value quantification is really, really useful. We should have been thinking about this back when we were developing the product." And those guys didn't just say it; they did something about it. So they said, "We're going to go back and rethink that." And that's what this is an example of how they started to change things. So the new product, they picked a pilot project, and this new product was a signal generator that, without getting into all the gory details, was very sophisticated stuff and was used for testing very advanced systems, whether it's in aircraft or very big, complicated systems. And so they would plug this thing in, and it could send signals throughout, and then they would determine whether or not they had problems or how the system was working. Very high-tech stuff that I never really quite understood. So they had a new product coming out, and it's very interesting as we look back at some of their other new product launches, they tend to underprice in amazing ways. They would create these great technologies, created real value for customers, and then they would raise the price by 3 or 4% because they were afraid customers wouldn't accept the price increase. So we started with this project, and they said, look, there's 3 key features. And in this particular product, it was the existing solution, both for them and for their competitors, involved 3 or 4 different components. You had to get them connected, installed, and it was a bit of work to get the system installed and working. So they created an integrated system that was one box, plug it in, is ready to roll. So it had an integrated package. That's the feature on the left. So it was a single box. Obviously, as all technology companies, they're faster, so it had a faster processor speed, which actually was useful for a lot of reasons here. And then they also had the ability to process signals in a much more, they'd spend a lot of time, they had a bunch of PhDs running around who are way smarter than anybody else, figuring out ways to process signals in a more sophisticated way. Now, they looked at that, and then we started doing some work, and we said, well, how do these kinds of benefits impact the customer's economics? And there's really 3 different ways. At the base, that dark blue bar, is that because there was only one box, they could get this thing up and running and set up on a system incredibly fast. Could save a day or 2 of time, which was significant. There was less downtime. Anybody who works in manufacturing knows if we've got multiple components we're hooking up together, that you're creating an opportunity for problems. So this failed less often, and to fix it, basically you plug another one in and send that one back, and so it reduced downtime significantly. And then they didn't have to buy all those extra boxes, so you only had one box to buy. So you looked at that and said, as we started looking at this created real value. We created some algorithms, developed, used some basic data points, and didn't do extensive research. We had enough data internally, created some estimates around what the value was, and we said, okay, this is looking pretty promising. So we moved forward, though, and here's where this really started. Now, prior to that, they had never spent a lot of time quantifying values. That was a new exercise for them. It took a little work for the team to get up to speed, get their mind wrapped around it, but they took to it very quickly. And then we said, but let's do something more. Let's ask ourselves for each one of those value drivers how much we could capture. And again, it was not a scientific exercise. It was a rough guesstimate. And so with the less auxiliary equipment, it's very interesting. It's real clear. It was a very clear value driver. You didn't have to buy as many boxes. We know how much those boxes cost, so it saved money. The less downtime. So we figured, and the team believed that they could capture a significant amount of that value. 75% seemed like a reasonable guess. Now, the less downtime, that was very credible, but it's one of those things that the customer can only know for sure when they buy the product and experience it themselves. So we felt like we couldn't capture quite as much value there. And then finally, the faster setup. The issue there was, yeah, everybody agreed, faster setup. It wouldn't take as much time. But as one customer said, but I think my guys would just go start drinking more coffee instead of going and doing something productive. So they weren't quite sure, whether that savings was realizable, even though the customers acknowledged that, yep, there was something there. So we said, we don't expect to capture as much of that value. Then we went back and we said, let's adjust those value estimates based on how much we could capture. And here's where it started getting interesting. Now, the three, and obviously there were more features than just these. We were using this as a prioritization exercise. But here's where it got interesting. The value capture was less, and it changed depending on which value driver was most important to to each feature, creating value for each feature. Where it got interesting was around advanced signal processing. And the reason it created a really good discussion amongst the team, because if you think about software is all about fixed costs. It's all the investment to create this capability, and then the actual cost to deliver is quite low. The variable cost was quite low. So they looked at this thing and they said, it doesn't create nearly as much value. Do we think it's worth it to invest the fixed costs when we're not going to be able to capture that on the back end? Now, ultimately, the decision was to move forward with the advanced signal processing, primarily because it was a positioning issue, and that they needed to continue to drive and differentiate the product against these Me Too competitors who didn't have this capability. So even though they didn't believe they were going to get paid as much as they would have liked for the value being created, they thought it was an essential component, that it was an enabler to get paid for the other things. So they decided to keep that feature in. So as they started going forward, it really got interesting now. So now we had a good estimate of what the pricing could be, how much price we could get. Obviously, and I'm not going to show it just for lack of time here, but we did a significant costing exercise as we were going through the development process. And then we did some basic economics. We did some break-evens that said, okay, if we price this thing up significantly, what would the economics look like? How much volume could we afford to lose before this thing wasn't going to be a success? And it was a real shock to the team. Now remember, this was a team that had been pricing their new products up 3, 4, occasionally getting incredibly aggressive and going 5%. And we said, no, let's take a look at 25%. And it took a little work. We worked through that. And the way we worked through that is because when we increased price by 25% here, what we found was that we could lose up to 33% of our volume and still be more profitable than we were before. And so the question to the team was, well, how much volume do you think we'd lose? And you know what we did? It was the simplest exercise ever. But we pulled up their customer base and we walked down one by one. And we said, what about this customer? Do you think you'd lose them? And the answer was no for all but about 8 or 9% of the customers and these were the customers that were only buying on price. They weren't buying because of the value, they were buying on the price. And the team said, you know what, we don't mind losing those guys because our strategy is to differentiate and create value and get paid for that value. So they were willing to give up that 8 or 9%. Well, long story short, they launched the product. And it was a significant success. This thing drove real dollars to the bottom line in the first 6 months that it was launched and thereafter. But I want to talk about, and so it was an economic success. But I want to talk about some of the things, how it changed in the internals of the company. One of the things that was really interesting is it really gave the product managers a level of confidence through the development process that they never had before. Because what would typically happen in this company is the product managers would come forward, they'd create a business case using that snatched out of the air price, good costing estimates, but they didn't have real confidence about what the economics of this thing could be. So they'd sandbag or they'd overestimate. They'd take it up to the management team. The management team would beat them up because this analysis wasn't robust and wasn't answering their questions. They'd send them back, and they'd iterate through this 3 or 4 times, and they weren't having an effective discussion about, is this a solid, is this product truly going to be successful? What things could we do to make it more successful? And so it changed the dialogue through the stage gates. The other thing that happened, the number of features that were rejected started to increase because now they had a basis to say, you know what? Yes, we know that the voice of the customer research says this is really good, but we've been working really hard on this, and either we can't demonstrate a value case here, or we can't get the cost down low enough below what the value might be to make this a sensible choice. And so you started seeing increased rejection and lower development costs, and that was a huge win for these guys. It really increased the efficiency of their development process. Now, the other auxiliary benefit that came out of this was that sales had a much clearer value story to support their launch pricing because we now had developed an economic value model, and that was following that through and refined as we're going through the development process. And so sales actually had a value story to tell to justify the significantly higher price than they were asking in the past. And so sales and product management started to work together more effectively because they were essentially using customer value as the common language. And then finally, average margins started to creep up after they started getting more of these products into the marketplace. The financial performance of the firm, actually, in the product portfolio started to increase. So just a couple thoughts. I mean, we're out close to the end of our time here. Just a couple of key learnings to take away. Number one is take a disciplined approach to analyzing customer value. I think it's very interesting whenever I work with companies or do training or do sort of market events. I always ask the question: how many people here take and understand customer value? And inevitably, a whole lot of people will raise their hands. And I said, well, how many people of those who have your hands up actually quantify that customer value and could put that in a model that is useful for making product development decisions, marketing decisions, developing sales collateral, pricing decisions, and the number of hands drops dramatically. So although a lot of companies say they take a value-based approach, my experience is the majority don't actually execute on that. And that's a really big difference here. Second is start early in the process. The sooner you can begin to create and build a value story around your features, ultimately around your product, around product versions, product bundles, etc., the earlier you start, the greater the benefits are going to be. Okay, so starting early is very important. And then the third is take some time to educate and work with all the stakeholders. And that means not just the folks up in development, but people in marketing, people in sales, and perhaps most importantly, the senior management team, because it's new. And quantifying value and using it as a key metric, the way we're suggesting here, is a different way for people to think. Now, those of you on this webinar probably already think that way. And so you look at this and say, of course, this is the most obvious thing that, we should all be doing this. But this can feel pretty darn new to other people in the organization. So let's remember that and help them cycle through this 2 or 3 times. Next thing you know, you're going to have the company lined up around customer value in a way that it's never been before. And I think that's a huge win for everybody. So Ed, thanks for
Oh yeah, no, John, thanks again. That was a great presentation. Great presentation. One of the things that I took away from this is how important having a visual analysis like you had, showing the complex trade-offs you have. We look at price and value, but also to put that third dimension, cost, is really, really important. And I think part of the benefit of this process or this structured approach is that teams can then visualize it, and it's one of the comments that we get from our customers using Leverage Point. You can start to make some real decisions about what you're really looking at, whether you're creating value models or setting price or developing the communications around new products?
Yeah, I got to tell you, Ed, this project was just about a year before Leverage Point came into existence.
Yeah.
It would have been hugely helpful. So we were doing all of this manually and using spreadsheets, and which was quite doable. The problem was it just made it much harder to replicate.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, I mean, at least when I work with teams like this, a lot of the conversations are around people trying to get a picture of what they're looking at. And when you have a picture that everyone can look at the same time, it becomes much more powerful to sort of answer the harder questions about, okay, what decisions that we need to make. All right, so John, I think we probably have some questions. But before I get to that, I just want to make a quick program announcement for our next webinar. So that's on June 26th at noon. We're really excited. This is our first webinar with our new strategic alliance partner, Calypso. Some of you, I'm sure many of you have heard of Calypso if you are in the innovation space. They are the world's premier innovation consulting firm, and they're experts in product development and product lifecycle management. We're delighted that Calypso has chosen Leverage Point as their technology platform to improve their clients' processes. The topic is going to be a continuation of what John spoke about today. The working title is Design to Value, How to Deliver Value-Based Innovations. We're especially excited to have one of the Calypso founders with us to be presenting. So the registration is going to be coming up next week. Look for an email announcement soon. Okay, John, let's get back to work here. Let's just take a look at some of the questions that have come in. So first one's come up, and this one we get a lot, is, you mentioned voice of the customer research as a way of collecting data. How do you collect the right kind of data to do this type of research?
It's interesting. That'll change as we go through the process. So, if you think about it very early on in the development process, a lot of times you don't want to invest huge amounts of time creating, investing in research until you've got a clearer picture of what you want to focus on. So typically, a lot of times what we'll start with is what we believe to be the value drivers and what those algorithms might be. So we actually start with some hypotheses using some secondary research, and that's at least a place to start. Now, where this really starts to get powerful, though, is when you go out and spend a little bit of time talking with customers. So typically, for a new product, we might, and it depends on how innovative the product is, how many segments we might be looking at, but we might interview anywhere from 10 or 12 customers, although I've done as many as 30 or 40 customer interviews, to try to understand their business models, to try to understand, where the product might impact, where there is white space. So typically we use an in-depth interviewing approach. Now, you can, over time you can augment that with surveys, et cetera, but I would say the majority of companies that I've worked with are satisfied using that sort of interviewing, depth interviewing approach.
Okay. And I just want to let our participants know that if you still have a question, feel free to add it to the list. Again, just type it into the right-hand panel. Related to that is a comment, more like, a comment on how you would use this approach for segmentation. So I imagine that adds another dimension to this. Here we're kind of assuming, I think in your case study, a particular customer segment, but how do you manage that if you have different segmentations, have different value?
Yeah, it's a really critical question. There just wasn't enough time to delve into that. In fact, there were about 4 major segments that the company was focused on and that we worked with. And for each one of those segments, we developed a different value model. Now, what was great is once we had developed the initial value model for their main segment, their primary, one of their main segments, then it was pretty easy to adapt the model, saying, you know what, these customers over here have a different business operational approach. So their business processes are a bit different. So some of the value drivers were less important, others were more important. And it was easy then, once we built that initial model, to adjust the model and the value capture rate accordingly. So once we had that first one done, it was fairly straightforward exercise to begin to adapt that to different customer segments. Beyond the scope of beyond the scope of a 30-minute webinar to talk about how we could actually build out a value-based segmentation, but would be happy to talk about that some other time.
Okay. So another question is, what happens in markets where competitors are constantly lowering price? So price is sort of like a moving target here, at least competitive pricing. Does that change?
Well, first of all, I'd say that's, in my experience over the last 3 or 4 years, that's virtually every market out there today.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a critical problem that everybody's facing.
Yeah.
And it really goes back to, I think, the fundamental, it's almost the paradox of the times. And the paradox of the times is that never before has it been so important for us to drive innovation and value into the marketplace. At the same time, it's never been harder to get paid for that as companies have gotten much more sophisticated about how they use procurement systems, how they extract that value, extract discounts. So it's something where all companies are dealing with. The key thing, and it's a much deeper discussion to show how we could actually protect that value. But I'll just give you one thing that is probably the most important thing we can do is in the development process, if we can develop the ability if we can develop flexibility into the versions of the product that are coming to market. In other words, we can create multiple versions. What it does is that we can think about it this way, we can create a low value version and a high value version. Let's keep it very simple. And the high value version's got the new technology, the low value version's more of a commodity product. And what it does is enable us now to go to market. And when that low price competitor who doesn't have the same value as our high value product starts to price aggressively, guess what? We'll go toe to toe with them and price aggressively on our low value product while we're maintaining our price and our margins on the high value product, because that's how we're going to continue to grow. And with a competitor who doesn't have that ability to protect their high value offers, they're at a significant competitive disadvantage. The last thing I would say about it is it's very interesting. Most companies, when they're facing intense price pressure from low price competitors, the feeling is the low price competitor has the advantage. And in fact, if you're smart and if you know what to do, you've actually got the advantage. You've just got to play the game the right way.
All right. Oh, that's great. Great answer, John. Okay, let's see. So this just came in. The most difficult challenge in putting reasonable metrics to quantify the value. Does LeveragePoint help with this? Let me just restate that. Most difficult challenge is putting reasonable metrics to quantify the value. Well, let me ask you first about what reasonable metrics are, and I'll try to answer the LeveragePoint
Sure.
side of it.
Well, when we're doing work and we're developing value models for whether it's for product development or pricing, metrics are where we start. And when we go out to talk to customers, one of the first things we ask is, what are the metrics that drive your business? And that typically starts at a very high level, growth, sales, revenues, whatever it may be. Yeah. But then we start to dig into that and ask them, well, okay, so what are the things that you're really looking at in terms of and we start to dig and get under the surface there. Next thing you know, you're talking about sort of operational metrics that are tied to those sort of revenue metrics, cost metrics, et cetera. And the next thing you know, you along with the customer rolling up your sleeves, and we're talking about their business, and you start to get a picture of what those metrics might be. Now, the one other thing I would say about it is that what typically happens is the first interview you're going in, you don't have a clear picture. It's not all new, but you're learning a lot of new things. You go to the second or third interview, and you're still learning lots of new things. But by the time you get to the sixth, seventh, or eighth interview, you start to hear the same things come up again and again. And as you start to see that overlap and those repeat metrics, now you realize, okay, that's where value is being created. Those are the metrics I want to focus on, and those are the ones that the customers are all going to recognize.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the way I begin to approach that.
Yeah, I think where LeveragePoint helps with that is, when you have sort of the best practices of the team captured in a platform, you're not constantly reinventing the wheel. You're not constantly having to think up keep finding that pattern. So we have a number of things within the platform that allows people to share and find and reuse thinkings about metrics. We have a full library functionality. So whether you're looking for the logic of how you think about this, or whether, where you find the data to find it, we have a lot built in there to help, and also to be able to share that across an organization. So that's my short answer on LeveragePoint. Okay, another question. How do you quantify a difficult subjective term like UI? Wow, that's a good one. I have an answer to that, but I'd like to hear what John has to say.
Oh, sure. And I've actually done it with a project in the, also I can say it was in the travel industry, where the UI was actually quite important for travel agents, et cetera. And it's actually not that hard. The trap here is to think because the feature is not tangible and tight that we can't quantify the impact, because we don't, in some sense, we don't care what the feature is. It could be a service, it could be a hardwired feature, it could be something like a UI, which is kind of a combination of all kinds of things. What we care about is how it changes what the customer does. And with the UI, and when we actually had to quantify this, we started to ask ourselves, well, how does that speed up or slow down the work processes for, and this is just one example, the work process for a travel agent. And what we found, it was very interesting. There was a segmentation issue here. For the power users who are used to using these old non-graphical UIs, they were really fast. And the graphical UI actually slowed them down. And that was a real finding for these guys. But for other users that were less sophisticated, not the power users, the UI saved them so much time because they didn't have to go look up a code. They didn't have to type it in. They could just click and go. They had help ready access to them. And in fact, what this company ended up doing, because they realized this was such an important value driver for them, feature that was driving value, they started doing they did a couple of workflow studies. And they found out and quantified exactly how much time was saved, documented it. It was a very, very powerful value driver for them. That's
a great answer. And I think the way I would approach that is, the technique that we use to think about value drivers is one that, borrowed from best practices, but that is feature benefit value driver mapping. So when you say something like UI, well, that's a feature, right? That's what the product does. You got to get it to the customer benefit. Why should they care? Right. And it's asking a lot of questions. Why is that important? Why is that important? And you're absolutely right, John. It does depend on the particular type of user or the type of customer. What we find is that things that people really care about generally have some sort of economic impact, right? And often it's time or productivity or things like that. So one last question. We get to ask this a lot. It's a relationship between this and conjoint analysis, because you're talking about different features and trade-offs. And how does conjoint fit into this type of work?
Well, first of all, I would say conjoint is a tool. I've used it many, many, many times. Very useful tool. But it measures fundamentally a different thing than economic value. What conjoint measures is essentially perceived value. So in other words, and it's oftentimes framed, those of you who are familiar with conjoint, it's oftentimes framed in the context of willingness to pay. So it's a measure of how much a customer might be willing to pay. Now, here's the problem with conjoint for new products, and there's a substantial problem here. If you're bringing new value to market, by definition, customers don't understand that value fully. It's new. And so if they don't fully understand the value, their willingness to pay for that may not be an accurate reflection of, once your sales team has gone out there and explained that value proposition, may not be an accurate reflection of what those customers would be willing to pay at the time of sale. And so it has a tendency for new products, for more innovative products, and again, this tendency is greater the more innovative the product is, has a tendency to underprice products. new products. So it's a good tool, it's a useful tool, but it's something that you should use with thought and understand.
Okay, great. I'm glad you addressed that issue. All right, so that's all the time we have left for today. We will be posting a recording of this webinar as well as the slides on our website probably later this week or first thing next week. Now, if you want to contact John directly, his contact information is on this last slide there, and feel free to send him any specific questions. And if you have any fan mail for us, here's our contact information as well. So I'd like to thank everyone again for their time today. Thanks for watching. Until next time.